Firouzja is the ultimate chess predator, and in this game he was preying on Alexandr Predke from Russia in round 3 of the FIDE Grand Swiss. So Firouzja had white, Predke black. Let's see what happened. And if you love a daily chess video, hit that subscribe button, never miss a daily upload. So e4 was played by Firouzja, and we went in for this Roy Lopez position. After bishop b5 we had a6, and we saw a number of standard opening moves here, both sides getting their pieces out. And after bishop e7 we had rook e1, pawn b5, bishop b3, and now black decides to play with an immediate pawn to d6 here. So you can castle as black, and then if white goes c3 you have the option of playing the marshal. But Predke didn't want to go in for any of this, so instead he played pawn to d6. Now we had c3 from Firouzja, castles from black, pawn to h3, all very standard stuff. And now here we had rook to e8. Often the knight moves there instead of rook to e8, preparing a c-pawn advance, but okay, that's a very logical move. We had pawn to d4 now from Firouzja, a standard break in the centre. Now you don't want to capture this one as black, because after white recaptures, they've set up the big centre, and this knight could even come to c3 now. So instead we had bishop to b7, and black's not afraid of white closing the position here with pawn to d5, because then the knight can hop in here, the bishop would come back, and pawn to c6 actually immediately undermines the centre. White is forced to take here, and black has a good game. So Firouzja didn't close the centre, instead he played knight b to d2, getting on with his development. We had bishop to f8, opening up the rook, and now pawn to a3 was played, clamping on b4. You can also go a4 there and allow black to go b4. It's a very rich position for both sides here. We had pawn to h6 now from black, bishop c2. So not only did this look in the direction of the king later, but also it clears the way for pawn to b3, freeing up this bishop to develop. So knight to b8 came, clearing the way for the c-pawn, and although it looks strange to underdevelop, it's going to sit nicely on d7 here. We had pawn to b3 now, b4 was also possible. Now we had knight b to d7, and now bishop to b2 completes the development of the minor pieces. So now we had rook to b8, and this move looked really strange to me when I first saw it, putting the rook on the b file opposite a load of pieces that are blocking it, but it's actually a very deep idea from both players now. So Firouzja follows up with rook to b1. Why is he also putting his rook there? And to show this, I wanted to show you what happens if you go bishop to d3 first, which is what was played in the game after the rook moves. Well, now you run into pawn to c5, and if you close the centre, which is how you'd like to respond to that break, then pawn c4 comes, and you can see this unprotected bishop now starts to look uncomfortable, because white wants to capture this, but after pawn recaptures, you could take with the knight, and black is doing well after knight c5. If you go with the bishop, well, now there's this tactic. Suddenly the rook on b8 looks great. So really deep stuff from both players here, and that's why Firouzja went rook to b1. Really interesting. Now g6 came because c5 isn't carrying the same weight. And now Firouzja wants to develop his queen into the game, but if he puts it on e2 here, it sits straight in front of the rook, and that's tactically tricky for white. So instead bishop d3 was played, and after pawn to c6, we had queen to c2 here. That's where the queen finds a nice home. So the middle game's well and truly underway now, and black starts this manoeuvre into the f4 square. The bishop drops back, anticipating the knight landing there, but here's where something weird happens in the game. So instead of playing knight f4, which does seem to be the best move in the position here, we had knight g7 played. Really odd, because the bishop sits nice there defending this pawn. Now maybe Predke was planning f5 here, or bringing the knight to e6 in some lines. I'm not completely sure, but Firouzja pounces immediately. So he takes on e5 now. We had pawn recaptures, and then pawn to c4 simply, and he's now targeting this pawn in a really uncomfortable way. There's no bishop g7 defending. Black's in some trouble here now. So rook to c8 was played, coming opposite that queen, Now the rook came to the d file opposite the black queen. We had queen e7 coming off that file, and now a really nice move from Firouzja, pawn to c5. So that one is now captured by the knight. He's giving up a pawn. What's going on here? Well, by capturing that pawn, the knight has left the defense of e5. So Firouzja jumps in and picks up that one. And now you need to get this knight out of the way at some point. It's blocking the c pawn, which is blocking the bishop. So knight d7 was played, looking to trade off. You can immediately capture that knight, but Firouzja goes for this much more swashbuckling move of knight d to c4. Awesome stuff, putting a whole knight on prise, but it can't be captured because if you take here, then can you see the follow-up? So it's rook takes on d7, forking these two pieces. Black is completely lost. So this knight wasn't captured. Instead we had captures here. The knight retook, and now the rook came to the d file to cover this critical square. We had queen to c3 now, lining up this battery against g7, and now pawn to h5 covered this g4 square because there was a plan here for white to go knight g4, bouncing into f6, which looks horrible. So Firouzja now chopped a pair of rooks on the d file, and the reason he did this was so that he could lift this one into the game. He's looking to come here. So rook c7 was played defending f7, and now Firouzja could go pawn to b4 here, but instead he plays rook to d3. He does take over the d file by playing like this, but black starts to come slightly back into the game now as he unravels the pieces. So bishop to c8 was played, covering this d7 square. Once again there was a threat to go knight d7 into f6. We now had pawn f4 from Firouzja, so he's throwing those pawns at the black king, looking to pick it apart, but now pawn c5 comes. Black just starts to get a small stake to the centre, taking over this d4 square. So rook f3 came, and now an excellent move from Predke, knight e6. So it looks to come into d4, and you don't have time to go f5, or now the knight lands there and also opens up the queen here, as we can see. So say you had captures, pawn captures, knight dropping back to d3 is best, although then you lose e4. If you try queen takes on d4, well, now bishop g7 is good. There's too many pins, white's actually in trouble. So after knight e6, Firouzja didn't push f5, he played pawn to a4. Now you can't capture here as black, or you give up this c4 square. That bishop's a monster. So instead we had knight to d4, the bishop had to take here, pawn recaptured, and now at least Firouzja wins this pawn on the queen side for all that pressure he had. So he is a pawn up here. Queen to b4 came, those queens got chopped off, the bishop was attacked of course, bishop recaptured, and now the bishop landed on c4. So although black's the pawn down, black does have the bishop pair, white has to be precise here. So king g7 played, rook f2, rook a7, and now knight c6 forks these two, but we have a check down here, the rook blocked, and they got exchanged off the board now. The bishop came to d2, hitting this pawn here, and you can't actually defend it like this, or you lose the h3 pawn with check. That's not very good, position's level. So instead Firouzja activates the king, gives that f-pawn, but brings it in very swiftly to the d-file. Bishop d7 now hit the knight. The knight took in the centre here, that pawn couldn't be protected anyway. And now Predke wants to get his kingside pawns going. Firouzja's going to get this one going of course, so he needs to generate counterplay, and that's what he's doing with g5. So king c3 now from Firouzja, he's clearing some space for the bishop. We had bishop e5, bishop e2, pawn to g4 now, and after this captures here, the king carried on marching in. So black brought his king in, the king came to d5, we had bishop to c8, so Predke wants to bounce around like this, pawn to b4 now, so passed pawns need to be pushed, bishop to b7 check, knight c6 blocks, and although you're in a self pin, obviously there's no tactical issues with just the one bishop on the light squares. Pawn to g3 now played. We had pawn to b5. Bishop to c7 blocks this b6 square, and now the king came to c5, renewing that threat of pushing b6. The king came to g5 here, and now pawn to e5 was a nice move from Firouzja. So he clears this e4 square and prepares bishop f3 here. And you can't take this piece as black, because after king takes, even though you pick up a pawn here, this one's actually going through too fast, and this one will be able to hold the pawn on g2. So we didn't have takes, we had king to f4 instead. Now bishop to f3, king to e3, pawn to b6, and now the bishop dropped back to b8, but already black was in huge trouble by this stage of the game and actually lost. But this walks directly into a tactic, so if you want to pause it and look for it, please do so. So the tactic's simple enough. You take that bishop on b8, but did you see it all through after bishop takes on f3? So the key here is that you don't recapture that bishop, because then black gets pawn to g2 and is queening really fast. White is actually still okay in this line. Say the knight hopped back, preparing to queen. You could give a check like this by taking that pawn, king d6. White will also queen soon, but okay, it's very tricky. Why go in for all of this when you've got a simpler win? So after bishop takes on f3, knight c6 is the move. Now black has to take on g2, and his piece stands in front of the pawn. So now we had b7, bishop e4, b8 queen, and after pawn to g2, queen b2 was the final move of the game. Because if you go pawn to g1 here and make a queen, then we have this skewer from the d4 square. We're picking up the queen after the king moves away. To see all of Firouzja's games I've covered in this tournament, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.